Greetings and salutations. Welcome to Life and Books and Everything. I'm Kevin DeYoung, joined with Justin Taylor and Colin Hanson. Good to have you with us as we come to, sad as it may sound, the completion of this season of Life and Books and Everything. Lord willing, we'll be back with more, perhaps after a break over some of the summer. Maybe we'll come back with special episodes in the summer. We've had such a resounding reply to our question about should we do a special episode on Abraham Lincoln books. I'm just thinking,
Thank you,
guys,
both of
maybe,
you who weighed in.
Yeah, both of you. Only one related to us. No, maybe that would be a spellbinding episode come 4th of July to talk about Lincoln books.
I mean, who actually goes out of their way to say, hey, I heard you guys talking about Abraham Lincoln. Please don't do a podcast on that. I have no interest in that. Who says that?
Well, so we'll see. But glad to have you with us, and glad, as always, to have Crossway as a sponsor. We're grateful for all of the great books that they put out. We've mentioned many of them over this season. Want to highlight today Recovering the Lost Art of Reading by Leland Ryken and Glenda Faye Mathis. And what other sort of book would be nearer and dearer to our hearts, Life and Books and Everything, a book on the lost art of reading. We want to do whatever we can to encourage people to be good readers and to read good books. And as this book says, to help us pursue the good, the true, and the beautiful. So check out that new book from Crossway. And speaking of new books, we are joined with our special guest today, Marvin Olasky of World Magazine renown. Marvin, good to have you with us. How long have you been at the helm of World?
Oh, about 29 years.
29 years. I should know my history of the magazine. I think I've subscribed to it for all of those years. But are you the first of the editors, the only?
No, Joel Bells started the...
Joel was before.
Yeah,
okay.
he started the magazine in 1986. And then I got involved first as a member of the board. And then when the board decided it couldn't have me, it didn't want me, they made me editor because that's the way to get me off the board. And we've lived happily ever after.
Yeah, well, I remember Joel started. I didn't know what the titles were. And we'll get to your book in just a moment. But you announced some time ago that you're in a longish runway towards retirement, or maybe that's not the word you're using, but a transition. How is that going? What are the plans for you and for World?
Oh, it's going well. Yeah, we have the right people in place. So I plan on July 1st, 2022 to no longer be editor-in-chief, no longer be involved in editing. Still, I hope, as long as they'll have me writing a column and book reviews and so forth, but all out of the process. And yeah, the right people are on the right seats on the bus at this point. So it's been a good transition.
I'm curious, what has been one of your favorite parts about this job? And what's one element? We all have parts in our job that we say, I won't miss that when I'm done. What's that part for you?
Oh, favorite part has probably been developing young talent. We tend to have a very young group of writers. We have a World Journalism Institute that trains them, and then we have interns. They live in our house with us for a couple of months, so we get to know them, and then usually we end up hiring them. And that's been a lot of fun, just seeing the development of the rookies. And some of them now have been with us for 10 years, and you can just see how much they have progressed as writers, as people, as Christians. So that has been enormously pleasurable.
And what, if anything, will you be glad to no longer have to do?
Good question. Probably no longer having to engage in some extensive copy editing at the last minute, just before deadlines.
Is that true for you, Justin and Colin? Although I think Justin, man, whenever I send him something, he seems to have great joy in copy editing.
Including text messages.
Yeah, he's not above correcting text messages.
Right.
Finding faults is one of my spiritual gifts in other people, not in myself. Same with typos.
Someone's got to do it. So,
Marvin,
right.
for those who might not be familiar with World, just could you give a very quick overview of what the magazine tries to do, who it tries to reach, what its goals and missions are?
Sure. I mean, right now we have three platforms. We have a biweekly magazine that tries to assess what's going on, report, really emphasize street level reporting, not just sitting in our offices and sucking our thumbs, but going out and seeing the stuff for ourselves and then telling stories about it. So that's the magazine. We have a website that basically functions as our daily newspaper. And then we have a podcast, a daily podcast, which is lots of fun. And that's the one that's been growing exponentially the past few years. So yeah, three things, and the emphasis on all of them is what we call biblical objectivity, namely God created the world. He's the one who knows how the world really works, and so we are only truly objective when we try to follow what the Bible says, and we try to do it in a way not to overuse the Bible and say it gives us a clear message about everything, politics and everything else, but also not to underuse it and say it's all up to ourselves because, there's no king in Israel. So yeah, it's an interesting process of trying to avoid the underuse, avoid the overuse, and practice biblical objectivity, which very few other people in the journalistic world do. So it's been fun developing that and training people in it.
Yeah, well, thank you for doing that, and thank you for trying to walk that fine line. I'm sure it's always easier to do one or the other, and write as if whatever our own convictions are equal biblical faithfulness, or act as if the Bible is basically good for telling us that Jesus rose from the dead and obey the Ten Commandments, and after that we really can't say anything. And I'm sure none of us do it perfectly, and World has to straddle that line, but we really appreciate how the magazine has tried to do that faithfully and really weighing in. Christian worldview is sort of overused, but doing that and yet not pretending that a conservative political take automatically has biblical warrant in every instance.
Yeah, exactly. We try to avoid polarizing as much as possible and avoid tribalism as much as possible. And since your words are very kind, let me just say, Justin and Colin, I appreciate your writing, and Kevin. When I'm walking my dog, I listen to sermons from Tim and from you, Tim Keller and you, and that's a pretty good league. And
well, yeah, if I'm in there with Tim, I won't ask how the dog is behaving or what the dog is doing when I'm preaching versus Tim, but I'm just glad that I get to be in such company.
Yeah, we won't go there with what the dog is doing, since I'm sure this is for families to be listening to.
Yes, for families. Very good. Well, I'm excited to talk about your new book, published by P&R, coming out soon, and it's called Lament for a Father, The Journey to Understanding and Forgiveness. It's a short book, a little over 100 pages, and this is a bit of a cliche, but it was a page turner, and it went by very quickly. And I'm really interested in asking you several things about this book. But I first wanted to ask: is the title a play off of the short book that Nicholas Wolterstorff wrote years ago, "Lament for a Son"?
Well, not in my mind, but it was actually P&R that suggested that title. I had a title, something like, honoring my father or something, and they brought that in. And I suspect it was in their minds.
Well, I certainly made the connection. I don't know how many readers would, but
Yeah.
it fit together nicely. Not many books will give you a kind of purpose statement from reading the dedication, but this book did. And so I want to start there. You say, here's a dictionary definition: a book dedication is a way for an author to honor a person or a group of people, end quote. And then you say, so in one sense, I'm dedicating this book to my father, who's the main character in it, but I'm also taking the unusual step of dedicating it to you, the reader. You may be looking at this page right now because you have unresolved conflicts with a parent, living or dead. You deserve more than to go through the rest of your life feeling either guilty or angry. I wrote this to blaze a trail through my own forest and to encourage you to do likewise. I can't remember ever reading a book dedication that made me want to go on and read the rest of the book. So start from there, and we'll be able to ask specifics about the story. But tell us your aim in this book and how the Lord brought you to a point that you wanted to blaze through your own forest, as you said.
Well, two things. About a year and a half ago, I wrote a column for World in which I told about never playing catch with my father, and told that story about one time we lived in an urban area, no backyard or anything like that. But one time I begged him to come out to the street and just throw me some ground balls. And he came out reluctantly and did it and threw a ground ball to me that I should have stopped, but I did not. And as you can imagine, on cement, it just went rolling and rolling and rolling. And when I finally caught up to it, and I yelled back at him, "Why didn't you throw it straight?" Namely, blaming him rather than my own error in not getting it. And as I got the ball finally and turned around, he was walking back into the house. So that was our total amount of time playing catch. And I just wrote that column as something explaining about relations of fathers and sons and so forth, and just got a tremendous amount of letters from readers, guys, saying, telling me the stories about their own interactions with their fathers. And so at that point, I thought this was something more than a personal story. It was something that resonated with lots of people, and that really got me cranking on it. But a few years earlier, I had just been thinking. I had read one of these verses in the Bible that everyone skips over. It's pretty much forgotten, abandoned somewhere in and somewhere in the Bible. There's a verse called "Honor your father and mother." And I just was thinking at that point, well, am I honoring my father and mother, since I had some negative thoughts about my father, because my mother had a hard childhood, a hard young adulthood, grew up very, was hoping that marriage would turn her life around. And when it didn't, she was very disappointed. And she took that out of my father, and I somewhat internalized her criticism. And so I thought ill of him, and then I thought ill of her for having nagged him and yelled at him and things like that. And that wasn't a good position as a Christian, or really for anyone to be in. And I thought, well, I need to look further into this to understand them better. I think when we're children and young adults, we tend to think of our parents as being of service to us. That's their job. But we never stop, or at least I didn't stop to ask, well, what pains are they having? What are they going through? How can I possibly be helpful to them? And so belatedly, I started thinking about this and then doing some research. This is after they're dead, but started asking my cousins their perceptions, and then going back in the records, what I could find out about what their lives were like and why they turned out as they did, what pains they had, what troubles they had, rather than just thinking about myself.
So, without making you repeat the whole story, which is very well written, and I notice in the book you write the whole stories you're writing with the present tense, even though you're telling the past tense, and I think that must be a journalistic decision, or a way to really bring the story to life and make sure that we feel it in the present. It kept me moving along. So your father's story, and you talk at the end too about your mother's story, but your father's story, in some ways, and I hope this isn't putting it too negatively, but we might think of the American dream as moving from hard scrabble life and early failures, and you recover and you keep pressing on and you push forward, and eventually you break through and there's a success, and you move from success to glorious sunlit uplands. And in some ways, your father's story was from not failure to success, but in a worldly sense, almost from success to failure. Maybe I'm putting it too harshly, but give us just a little bit of that backbone of your father's story, from Harvard, World War II, a series of jobs that didn't seem to go anywhere after that.
Sure. My mother, her big complaint was that my father lacked ambition. And she said very explicitly, sometimes at the top of her voice, that he's lazy. And why doesn't he make something of himself? And I thought, okay, this is who he is. Then I belatedly finally asked Harvard College for his records, just his transcript. And after some nagging on my part. The folks there finally did it. I had to produce a death certificate for him and information on myself and so forth. But they sent me, and it wasn't just the transcript. It was his application material. It was all the correspondence that went on among the professors and administrators concerning his performance at Harvard. And what I learned is that he had been an enormously ambitious person. He had graduated from Malden High School, with Malden, a suburb just north of Boston, working class, fairly poor at that point, also heavily Jewish. And Harvard at that point had a quota on Jewish students, sometimes no more than 10%, sometimes no more than 15%. But the Jewish students tended to be academically advanced, and Harvard did not want to be overrun with Jews. A lot of anti-Semitism at that point in the Harvard administration. So he applied to Harvard in 1935 and was turned down flat. And his application material is fascinating. It was from neighbors who said, "Oh, he's a fine Jewish boy. He's in the tradition of the rabbis and the sages." That was exactly the wrong stuff to apply to Harvard with. He didn't give up at that point. He somehow finagled his way, with the help, I think, of a mentor in Boston, to a supplementary year after already graduating from high school, a supplementary year at Boston Latin. Boston Latin was a feeder school for Harvard. And he went there, his grades were good enough, and the recommendations he attached to his application at that point, totally different. Not, oh, he's in the tradition of the rabbis, but he's a very manly man. He has good character, which were all dog whistles in a way, saying he's one of us. He's not like one of those Jews you don't like. He's a Boston Latin graduate at this point, and he is proper. He's a gentleman and a scholar at this point, and he got admitted. His father wanted him to be a doctor. This is what you did when you're really upwardly mobile. He did not do well in his pre-medical courses. He switched to anthropology after a battle with his father. And just to keep this short, he also, in the process at Harvard, switched theologies. His father was Orthodox. He grew up believing in Adam and Eve as real people. He majors in anthropology and faces something that's totally antithetical to that. It's all Darwinian evolution, and he has to decide whether he's going to accept that and fit in at Harvard, or he's going to stick with his father's beliefs. And he just totally throws over the Judaism. And that's something I didn't know. I thought that had developed later in life, but it's right there. I got his senior thesis. And in the senior thesis, he says, nothing special about the Bible, nothing special about the Israelites, just another ancient Near Eastern tribe, just another ancient Near Eastern document. So he tried to fit in. He had totally thrown over the theology of his youth and his father's beliefs. So that I didn't know. I didn't think it came early. I thought it developed slowly over time, but he really wanted to fit in. And that I found interesting and surprising. He was very ambitious. He wanted to do well at Harvard. He wanted his professors to think well of him. And that meant changing his beliefs about some very basic and important things.
So it was just fascinating to watch you put decades and decades and decades of journalistic skills into researching your own father's history and watching that transform and to change you and to challenge you as this project progressed. Why don't you jump ahead to World War II? It sounds like you had to be a little bit speculative about what your father had, because I think his records had burned. Is that correct?
Right.
His service records there. So tell us a little bit about how you reconstructed his World War II service, because you seem to identify that perhaps as the great turning point in his life.
Right. Well, he had been successful enough at Harvard to gain admission to the Harvard Graduate School in anthropology. But after a year there, they kicked him out. And I have some surmises on that, but let me move on to World War II. His dad, my grandfather, worked at a place that was making boilers for submarines. So he was able to get a deferment, and he could have sat out the war, which he would have liked doing, except he heard what the Nazis were doing to Jews. And so he enlisted. He had a draft affirmed, but he enlisted, went to Europe, was packing parachutes for flyers. And so he was first in England, then in France and Italy for a while, and then in France, very close to Germany. The war ends. There are all these refugees. There are all these people in concentration camps, the few who survived, but a lot of them, given the extent of the German concentration camps. My father grew up speaking Yiddish. He knew German. He actually got high honors in German from Harvard. He was in, after the war, he was not demobilized until the very end of 1945. What was he doing during that period from May through December? The Army had put out a call for any soldiers who know German, who are fluent in German, and can speak to the people in the camps and the refugees and so forth. I don't know this for sure, but on his when he was separated from the Army, he received notices about all the various campaigns he had been in, where he had been, and one of which was basically Central Europe, Germany. What was he doing there? The Army would not have had him just sitting there for 6 months when you have someone who's fluent in German. My surmise, and again, he would never talk about this, and the Army records burned up, so they can't tell me for sure. But my surmise, with I think about 85% certainty, let's say, would be that he was sent to be a translator to the nearby concentration camps in Germany. And that may also explain why he would never talk to me about it, because he must have seen, if he were there, again, I think 85% certainty, he would have seen some actually incredibly horrible things, just naked bodies stacked up, hands and feet and various bodily organs kept in special jars, all kinds of terrible stuff. He never talked about it. He came back, quickly got married, but he changed his career at that point. Now, Harvard had kicked him out, but he was allowed to go back to Harvard as a graduate school in Semitic studies. He never did it. He was interested in preserving Judaism as a culture. Here, 6 million Jews, a third of the worldwide tribe, had been killed. He thought, okay, we are possibly going to go extinct because so many American Jews don't know anything about Judaism. So I am going to do what I can do. Forget about anthropology, forget about getting a doctoral degree. I am going to work in Hebrew schools and convince people to stick with Judaism. The odd thing about that, I think we can all recognize that, is that he was missing at that point the essence of Judaism, a belief in God, a belief in the Bible as God's word. He didn't have that, but he still wanted people to, as members of the tribe, to stick with Jewish culture. And that left him, I think, in some ways in a very uncomfortable position. And the rest was just a series of failures in various ways, particularly for my mother, who married him thinking, aha, he's going to become a professor. He's going to become, it's going to be Dr. and Mrs. Olasky. I'll be able to travel around, see the world, enjoy the esteem that he has. And she was very disappointed that none of that happened. So, and I tend to trace that, again, my surmise here, to his experience at Harvard, having gone all the way to accepting a different theology and ideology, and they kick him out. Getting married with expectations of having a loving wife, and she turns out to be not so. And then particularly just what he saw in the concentration camps and the effect that had on him on wanting to keep Judaism culturally alive because so many Jews have been killed.
You just alluded to the fact that your father was very reticent to talk about his experiences and the horrors of what he saw. And I think in contemporary culture, we think of that as a defect, that someone is not willing to be candid about their own feelings and own experiences. But as you reflect as a mature Christian in the book, looking back, you actually see this as something of a mercy. Can you explain how you came to that conclusion, how you view that today?
Well, I do see it as mercy because I became a Christian at age 26 purely through God's grace. God all the way doing this, not my desire, not my attempt to learn things, just God intervening in my life and turning me around. But the benefit I had because of my father was what many Jews, at least of the previous generation, did not have. Namely, they had a history of anti-Semitism. My father, I suspect, had experience of anti-Semitism in Boston, and then particularly seeing the most graphic anti-Semitism, namely all those dead bodies stacked up. So he had that sense of hostility towards Christians. I didn't have that sense. I think that was a real help in coming to Christ. Again, God pushed me all the way. God pursued me all the way, but I didn't have those barriers, psychological barriers, and my own experience telling me Christians are nasty people who beat me up. I never had that. And if he had told me the stories of what he saw in Germany, or perhaps even what he had experienced as a teenager in Boston, I suspect I would have had some of that hostility, and I just didn't. So I'm very thankful that he protected me from that. I suspect he also protected my mother from that, but in some ways that made his life harder because he could not explain to her really why he was committed to these jobs, teaching in Hebrew schools, teaching kids who really didn't want to be in the room, and parents who didn't have much interest either, except for social reasons. So yeah, this in a sense, and this is taking it a step too far, and it's a step he would not like to be even configured or referred to in that way. But in a sense, it was Christ-like. I mean, he was just keeping this on himself and not sharing the misery with others, even though it might have led others to be more compassionate towards him.
Colin.
At one point, you alluded to this earlier, Marvin, all of us as fathers realized that our fathers had been sons at some point. And that realization made a big difference for you as well. We also realized that as we age, we become so much like our fathers, or at least that's what we worry about or have to deal with. You had such a dramatic conversion that you're talking about here. Is that the case with you? I mean, were there any of those areas where you saw yourself aging into your father, or was it just the break so definitive that you really saw no connection there?
That's a very good question, and I would like to deny any comparisons of that sort. But no, I suspect in terms of psychologically liking to read, a certain introspection, or rather being with and being in my house rather than doing other things. So I see some similarities there as I've gone older, but here's one big difference. If people have asked me, well, where's your favorite place? I've traveled a lot internationally, and people ask where's my favorite place, and I've sometimes responded, well, it's the next place. It's the place I haven't been to, and that's my tendency. I mean, I do like to go and see things I've never seen before. And interestingly enough, with my father, he had this big adventure, which is in some ways a very difficult adventure. I mean, first being in the army, and suddenly for a kid who had never eaten pork before, basically pork and beans and all that, and being with a lot of people, not having a lot of privacy, and then along with the basic army stuff, just seeing these horrendous sights in Germany. That was so traumatic for him, I imagine, that he never went anywhere again unless he absolutely had to. I mean, the stories my mother told with some exasperation is they at one point took a trip to Washington, D.C. To see the things, and he just stayed in the hotel room for 2 days. He came once when I was working in Delaware. He went around on a tour of a place near Delaware with very beautiful plants and flowers, winter tour, and he was walking along through the vegetation, reading a paperback book, carrying in his hand. So there was something traumatic that he had. I mean, I knew that, and in that way, I am not like him, but I see similarities, I see differences, but at least the strangeness that I saw at that point, I think now there's a reason for it.
Yeah.
And it's not something I blame him for. It's things that happened to him, and he reacted in a particular way with basically PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I never appreciated that as a child or even as a young adult. I just didn't understand at all about that.
Well, the story that you tell is really well told, and as Colin said, you're putting all your years of historical research, journalistic expertise, and you tell it really well. I want to transition a little bit, and this touches on the biography, obviously, but talk about some of the psychology, even the theology, because that's sort of what I think is driving the book. And the subtitle is The Journey to Understanding and Forgiveness. And you end the book talking about how Christ can heal even these difficult relationships. So I'll get to your relationship with your father in just a moment. But before I do that, there's a lot about your mom in here too. And she has her own story, coming from a very difficult background, and her father, very difficult circumstances as a Jew and immigrating to this country, her family. But talk about the relationship between your mom and your dad. And one of the themes I see in the book is it seems like your mom wanting a husband that she can respect and provide for her and look up to, but then that coming out in some unhealthy ways. And then your father feeling somewhat constantly defeated by your mom's anger and nagging. I'm not trying to put words into your mouth, but talk about the relationship between your mom and your dad, how that shaped each other in their disappointments and how that affected you.
Yeah, that's a good summary you've given. Um, yes, my mother grew up with a hard and sometimes brutal father who had been brutalized himself in Russia before coming to the United States. Had worked very hard, had achieved a lot economically, but was not kind at all to his children. And she grew up, as she told us, never having a teddy bear, never having any real love in the family, at least from the parents. Uh, her mother, my grandmother, was abused by her husband in lots of ways. So a miserable childhood, and then she had to be working. She was actually smart, but never got a chance to go to college. Uh, and she is 28 at this point in 1946, and feeling miserable. And she meets this guy who's just back from the war, and he pays some attention to her. Uh, she respects him. He's smart. He's going to go places. He's going to become, again, Dr. and Mrs. Olasky, and I will have reflected glory. My miserable life is in the past. From now on, we're going to have some money, but even more than that, we're going to have influence, fame, admiration. He was my Prince Charming in a way. And they got married late in 1946, not all that long after meeting each other. And he disappointed her. And, I can blame my mother for not loving him, but she was desperate and she was hopeful, and all her hopes were dashed at that point. I can blame my father. In other words, there's plenty of blame to go around, but helped by the Bible and pastors, many good sermons. I understand something about original sin, and that manifests itself in lots of ways, including our tendency to blame others when our hopes don't come through, and we realize that yes, we are not married to Prince Charming or anyone else with charm. We are married to the people God has given us, and our task in marriage, sometimes happily. In my situation, I've been married for almost 45 years, and I am hugely grateful to God for my wife. But other situations, the marriages are miserable, as with my parents, but I give them credit for sticking together. Today, they would have gotten a divorce, I suspect, and that would have made life even harder for my brother and myself. So I can blame them, but I can also look at the things they did for us. I had a teddy bear. My mother never did. We always had food, which sometimes my mother did not. So yeah, I had a car to drive. I had this, I had that. So both materially, they protected me. I mean, we were lower middle class, but we had enough. Materially, they protected me. Psychologically, they protected me. They were actually good parents, despite all the other stuff that came along that I was blaming them for at the time. In terms of the basic stuff, um, having us having us physically and more or less psychologically whole, they did their jobs, and I didn't give them credit for that.
In an age where it seems that every person is blaming their hangups and their faults and their shortcomings upon something that can be traced to their parents, I think I would love people to read this book, if for no other reason, as a tribute to common grace, the way in which you are able to see God's grace through difficult circumstances. So I just want to commend that as a model for listeners. It's a beautiful book that is really well told and does honor your mother and father, even when there were less than honorable things.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, this to me, towards the end, I'll read a couple paragraphs that you wrote so well, Marvin. This really gets, I think, the theological and the spiritual heartbeat of the book. You say, we are naturally wretched, passing on original sin in many ways that are sometimes creative but often repetitious. At first glance, an iron chain bonds together generation after generation. And I'm part of that chain. I've realized in the course of this research how self-centered I was, not only as a child, but as an adult. Why did I have so little interest in seeing my parents, not primarily as people to meet my needs or not, but as individuals with their own struggles? I never really cared to find out about them. Yet sometimes, with God's grace and mercy, that iron chain becomes a readily breakable daisy chain. Those who see the miraculous transition cry out joyfully, as Apostle Paul did, "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from the body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ, our Lord." Talk about how I love that you put that iron-clad chain and that daisy chain, and that gets to what Justin is talking about. On the one hand, in generations past, I think we could say people often overlooked and didn't pay attention to the ways in which they might have been shaped by their past, by their upbringing, by hard circumstances. It was, stiff upper lip, grin and bear it. And we maybe didn't have sympathy for one another like we should have to understand how affected we are. And yet, if the pendulum is swung to the other side, it's to say that we're only the product of bad experiences, bad people, and perpetually at the mercy of those experiences. So how did God help you, Marvin, and how can you or can we help others understand that yes, there is a chain, but it can be a daisy chain? What did you mean by these two paragraphs here?
Well, part of that comes out of some of the history writing I did concerning poverty in America and the history of poverty in America. So back in the 90s, spent a lot of time talking with homeless guys, particularly some who were still in that situation of misery, others who had changed, and just about always, there may have been some rare exceptions, but just about always, what changed them was coming to Christ.
Hmm.
And without that, they still, with some exceptions, they still had an iron chain around them. They're still homeless. They would still rather be drinking and drugging rather than getting their lives in order. So when I would talk with the people who run homeless centers, and there was a debate at that time, and it's still going. Let's say you're offering a dinner, a free dinner to people who come in. Should you also, with that dinner, offer a sermon or a homily or at least some discussion of spiritual things? And there are some folks who say, well, no, we don't want to intrude on their religious liberty, so we're just going to give them food and let them go off. I think as Christians, we understand that the spiritual food is at least as important as the material food, in many ways more important. If a person is starving, he needs the material food right away, but he also needs the spiritual food. And so you're not being kind to people if, in fact, you don't try to explain a little about Jesus and what Jesus does for us, and why we should try to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. So the definition we have of compassion, of just kind of giving people stuff, is not a good definition. It's not a good understanding. And so I look at that history and I see that when Christian charities have been effective in fighting poverty, it's because they have had that understanding that the spiritual food and the material food are both necessary. And then when I look more recently and see some charities that haven't been effective, it's usually for that as well. So I basically applied that understanding to my own life, and the lives of others. Namely, what's the solution? It's Jesus. It's Jesus, and all the other stuff. Once in a while, it may work to some extent, but it doesn't over a long period of time, or for most people. Christ changes life. J.I. Packer's great 3 words: God save sinners, and nothing else works. So,
Amen.
Yeah.
It's so simple, and yet we need to hear it over and over again. Those of us who've been in the church a long time, sometimes we think we forget, yet Jesus does still save people. It's not just in the missionary biographies. It's not just in Marvin Olasky's story. He still does it. He still saves sinners. He still changes lives. I have 3 last questions. I'm going to ask the first one, and then I'm going to let Justin and Colin see if they have a last question, and then I'm going to give myself the last 2. So here's my of my 3. Marvin, this is I'm not trying to flatter, but I think this is a remarkably wise and humble book. You start with, my dad only played catch with me one time, and there's obviously real pain, and there's real ways in which your dad failed, and yet you come to the end realizing you needed to learn who he was as a person with all of his failings, and understand even God's common grace in that. So it strikes me as very wise and humble. And I kept thinking, do you think, is there a way for a son or a daughter to come to your sort of God-given wisdom and humility at 70, I think you said in the book? You're 70 years old now?
Yes.
Do we have to wait till does it just come because you need to get to 70? Can a child see this when they're 30 or 40?
I hope so. I think so. I can't give you any research results on that, but my hope is the case, and that's a large reason, along with just working out my own understanding. That's a large reason why I wrote this book. Namely, while your parents are alive, talk with them, try to learn their histories. Don't think of them as just feeding tubes for yourself. What can you do for them? And ask the questions while they're still alive. Do it. And don't wait. I mean, I kick myself now. Some of the things that I have 85% certainty about. I could have had 99% certainty about. Again, I don't think my father would have told me very much, but I could have talked with other people. I could have looked earlier on for records that perhaps at that point would not have been destroyed by the fire, the army record. I could have, if I had been interested, I could have gotten his background and then sat down with him and said, "Hey, I have learned this about you, and I thank you for protecting me, for not telling me about all this. But now I know it. So tell me now, talk with me more about this. Explain what you were thinking, what you were going through." And had I asked more specific questions, maybe he would have opened up, but I didn't. And so this book is for readers who, and I suspect maybe there'll be older readers, but if there are people in their 30s and 40s who read it, or even, people older, but they're teenagers. Yeah, that's the age in which in
I'm
which
gifting it to all of my
I
children.
was gonna say buy some copies for your own family there, Kevin.
you know,
It could be
I know.
worse.
I know teenagers have a trinity: me, myself, and I. I mean, that's
Right.
at least that's the teenager I was.
Yeah.
So, but yes, give it to who knows.
Yeah.
But yes, that's right. As parents, start early and suggest to your kids, I am here to talk with you about my background. This
Yes.
is an open mic. Talk, ask.
Ask
But
me.
anyway,
Well,
yeah,
but I do love, and I asked you the question because I want people to hear just what you said there, and that is, I don't want to psychologize everybody out there that it's all about father wounds, but you just wonder the way people are on social media, the pain they carry, the way that they attack. I mean, all sorts of things. We sometimes don't stop to really think, and especially as Christians, to let the Lord deal with us, speak to us through His Word. How are we acting out of the various hurts and bitterness and pains that we have in our own lives? And to read a book like this can at least help us ask those sort of questions and explore some of those avenues and try to come to a better gospel place before we're 70 or 80. Justin, and then Colin, and I have two quick questions to close.
Let me quote one of my favorite lines in the book. You're right. I didn't honor him when he was alive, but I can tell his story now with appreciation for his sacrifices and sadness about his sadness. And I think in that one line, it captures a lot of the heartbeat of the book and your perspective. And there's an honor element. We are commanded to honor our parents. There's a telling the story. That's something you can do now. You can honor him now. You can tell a story now. You can have appreciation for the good. Nobody is pure evil. There is common grace in every life. And then there is sadness. There's lament. There's empathy. There's identification. And so I love all four of those aspects of honoring, telling, appreciating, and identifying with. And I don't know if you intentionally thought of those in terms of a fourfold kind of schema, but that again to me seems like a model that we can learn from you before it's too late, of honoring our parents. And we also tend to think of honoring our parents as when they're alive, and that's the ideal, but we can continue to honor their memory, and I think you've done a wonderful job of that.
hey, I can see you're a good editor. You've summarized it better than I have. So thanks. Yes.
That's great. Good summary. Colin?
My question is actually not on the book. So I think, Marvin, man, I'd love to have you as a guest on Gospel Bound, and we could just talk journalism that whole time and the things that you've seen in the last 30 years and changes and what you think is the prognosis going forward. But I'll save that maybe for a different time if you're willing.
Sure.
But I would be interested to know, we're actually recording this podcast when we've just got news that the Supreme Court is going to take up a direct challenge to Roe v. Wade.
Wow.
Do you have any thoughts on that? The Mississippi ban, by the way, is what they're taking up.
Really? Wow. No, that is good news. I wrote a little book called came out recently called Abortion at the Crossroads, which was looking for something like that and preparing for something like that. So no, I'm very glad to hear that. And as Justin knows, I'm starting a longer book for Crossway on the full history of abortion in America. Wrote one 30 years ago and thought I was done with it, but abortion still haunts me as it haunts all of you, and I hope haunts millions of Americans. So yeah, I can't leave it behind. It is still the single, with everything else going on. It's still like slavery in the 1850s. It's still the single biggest. Of course, the biggest flaw. It all comes out of theology and bad theology, but the biggest social problem we have right now, I think, much like slavery in the 1850s, is abortion in the 2020s. And I'm glad to hear the court will be dealing with it, and hope they actually are wise. Let me just say, I mean, everyone knows that the history that Justice Blackmun put forth in Roe v. Wade is just full of holes. It's just terrible. It was the decision, and I usually have great esteem for Supreme Court decisions, just the way the logic of them, whether I agree with them or not. I find them thoughtful and interesting to read, and that is just like a college paper that a good professor would flunk. So I hope the court right now, unlike in Casey in 1992, I hope the court will say, hey, yes, we understand the principles of stare decisis, to leave it alone, but the history is so bad, the judgment is so fallacious that we just can't let it stand. It's just much like Dred Scott decision, the blood on the Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade will go down that way. And I hope the court justices, or at least a majority of them, are ready to fix it. That's great.
Amen.
Amen. So, question, life, books, and everything. Are there any books in your writing of this book about your father that you want to recommend that deal with fatherhood, fathers and sons, family, anything from the bibliography or anything fiction or nonfiction that you want to recommend on the subject?
Calvin Trillin, who wrote for The New Yorker, wrote an enjoyable book to read about his dad and their relationship. It's in the bibliography. I don't remember the title offhand, but that was the most enjoyable read. A lot of other stuff was painful, and no, I mean there's a lot of stuff written from the viewpoint of, or one viewpoint of, secular psychology, but it doesn't get at the real stuff. So yeah, if there are listeners who know of a Christian book that really has good theology and examines father-son relationships, I'd be interested in it. Do you have any suggestions or anything you've read?
Well, I'm interested in reading on the subject. I'm blessed with a good father, and hopefully my kids will say they've been blessed with a good father. But I think it often doesn't come out as much as it should in our social commentary or understanding of the age. Was it Mary Eberstad who had the article in First Things last year, the fury of the fatherless, or something like that, looking at the some of the social unrest and riots, and then she was also connecting it to some of the major Enlightenment figures in the West, many of whom either had very bad fathers or absent fathers, or themselves were not fathers. And so, as she's done in some of her books on family and understanding the relationships between family ideology and spiritual trends, I've read her stuff helpful, and that article was helpful. Was it Paul Vitz, who had the book from several years ago that covered some of the same themes? So I'm making a note of that. Calvin Trillin, Messages from My Father. So that's in the bibliography, and maybe some of our other intrepid listeners rather, will have other examples. I wonder, last question, what would you say in just a few sentences, hard to do, but to someone who's listening to this right now, and they're listening to this whole thing, and they feel like, wow, I have or had a bad father. What counsel would you give them? And then what would you say to someone who says, wow, by God's grace, I'm really, really thankful for my earthly father? You have a word of counsel, encouragement to both of those groups?
Yeah, for the first person who has had a bad father or thinks of his father as a bad father, try to be counsel for the defense, basically. What would you think if this were a court and your father were sitting there as an accused perpetrator, and what defense does he have? What would you want to, if you're the lawyer for your dad? What questions would you ask him? How would you try to understand where he's coming from, why he did what he did? I think that would be useful, just to try to put yourself in this frame of mind, trying to be generous to your father. You owe your existence to him. So even if he was a bad father, at least you have your life. And yeah, what can you do? How can you learn? What can you learn to try to appreciate him? Try to put yourself in that frame of mind. And if you have a good father, like every other blessing we have, this is from God. And we can ask, why does God in his majesty and wisdom and grace, why does he, in a sense, why does he choose some and not others? And we could get into all that. Why not this person? Why not that person? Well, why did God give you a good father? We don't know, but boy, thanks be to God. So I would just try to be in that frame of, and on the first person, I try to be in a lawyerly or detective frame of mind. In the second situation, just try to be grateful and thank God for that great blessing.
Yeah, that's a good word to end on. Thank you for joining us and for this book. Again, Marvin Olasky's written the book, Lament for a Father, The Journey to Understanding and Forgiveness, comes out by P&R. Looks like it is due to come out the very first part of June, so it may be available at good retailers anytime in the next days or week or two. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for the good work that you're continuing to do with World. And Justin and Colin, good to be with you for this season, and we'll just tease it out there that maybe we'll try to get the band back together for a special episode sometime over the summer, but we are taking a bit of a break now. I'm going on 4 weeks of study leave to do some writing starting next week, so it's good to have been with you all. We're grateful for all of our listeners, for Life in Books and everything. So until next time, glorify God, enjoy Him forever, and read a good book.